if you'd like to say that.
No, thank you. Okay, we're live on YouTube Live, and now we are on Challenge Jewish History, another edition. Welcome to Lipika Pelham, who's the author of Jerusalem on the Amstel: Quest for Zion in the Dutch Republic. And this book was published by the Oxford University Press. Is about the Sephardic Portuguese Jewish community of Amsterdam. And first of all, a warm welcome. Thank you so much for joining us, Mrs. Pelham.
Thank you for having me. Thank you.
So this book, which I found really, really interesting, is thoroughly researched. It's chock full of information about a very unique community of Jews. And this is, of course, not your first book and not your last book. We'll talk about your other book soon. What makes this, first of all, what got you into the subject?
The sort of how I got interested in this research is, I must say a few words about it. It was, I think, the BBC who I worked for. I used to work for the BBC all the time. I mean, full time, and I think. When was that? 2017. The BBC World Service asked me to do a program on 500 years of the Reformation from the Jewish point of view, and I was lost for a while because of course, how can I tell the story of the Reformation from the Jewish angle? And I don't think much. At the time, I didn't see very many pieces of work that other people have done. So I started kind of thinking and asking around, and then suddenly I realized that previously I had visited Amsterdam, and I remember one of the most impressive landmarks in Amsterdam is the Portuguese Jewish synagogue, and that wouldn't have been possible. The history of the synagogue, the building of the synagogue in the 1670s wouldn't have been possible without the Reformation, without the opening of the Protestant world for other communities, or so-called the Carnival of Nations that arrived at the Dutch at the shores of Amsterdam following the Spanish Inquisition and the opening of the borders into the Dutch Republic. That was the beginning of it. But as I started researching, obviously, I couldn't believe the era, the world, the rich world that was unfolding before my eyes. That was the beginning. Believe it or not, I never made that BBC program. I instead wrote a book.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Right. So tell us, in short, about what this book is all about and what this book adds, what other books have not discussed, perhaps.
Well, as I've said, that what the book examines is that how on the banks of the Amstel River in Amsterdam, out of a group of Iberian New Christians, a whole new type of Jewish community came into existence. So what is interesting is that this beginning of Jewish history in Amsterdam is that it wasn't Jewish at all. It was founded by recent converts to Judaism, and communities, and from that, the community came to Amsterdam as Catholics and established themselves as a prominent, prosperous community, and ushering in the kind of age of enlightenment in Europe. And the community would see the major figures like Spinoza, Uriel da Costa, Manasseh ben Israel, and all these major icons in Jewish philosophy and Jewish, even like kind of, what we said, the first idea that was born, the so-called binational state, that a term that we talk about quite a lot about, peacemaking. So one of the first peacemakers was Ben Israel, and, he made sure that Jews were allowed back into England, as, we know, and, through his the letter that he wrote to Oliver Cromwell, and that sort of enabled Jews to come back to Britain. So the book actually starts from the very beginning in sort of 1603, when a remarkable thing happened. A Yom Kippur service was held, in Amsterdam by the newly converted Jews who converted from Catholicism to Judaism after a break of some 200 years. And that's the kind of beginning of the book. But shall I go on or?
That's
about
fine.
The Yom Kippur service, which is interesting.
You can go ahead. Sure. Keep on going.
So it happened in a house on the port of Amsterdam, which belonged to Samuel Palash, who is a Moroccan Jewish diplomat from Fez, and who was actually in town at the time, not to kind of talk to the fellow Jews, the fellow sort of Portuguese, Spanish former compatriots, but he was in town to actually broker a trade deal on behalf of the Moroccan Sultan Moulay Zidane and with the Dutch House of Orange, and which was represented by Stadtholder Prince Maurice. It was a deal that was to be forged in their mutual understanding of the common enemy, which was Catholic Europe. Because at the time, the narrow strait between Ceuta and Andalusia that had been inundated with Spanish ships and that were not allowed, that were coming from the New World. So he was there to broker the peace deal, and then he realized, oh my God, this city is full of people from my ancestral home from Spain and Portugal, and then he realized that these new converts were or the Catholics, the Iberian citizens, Iberian immigrants who were actually being converted by a Ashkenazi rabbi, Levy. And that shocked him. She thought that they couldn't, because two branches of Judaism, they didn't kind of mingle for until that point, because their paths were separated since the Great Dispersion and in the 2nd century, and they didn't even intermarry. So he thought, that can't happen. I can't let my people to be converted by an Ashkenazi rabbi called Uri Halevi. So he took over. And that was the background how he became their rabbi. He was appointed their rabbi at some point, and then started working with the Ashkenazi rabbi, and then started kind of re-educating them into Sephardi Judaism.
That's interesting, because this kind of, I guess, division or stratification of lines between the Sephardi Jewish community and the Ashkenazi Jewish community, which would develop a little later, continued for many, many years, and to in some degree it still exists today in the Netherlands. What was if you want, can you tell us a little bit more about what the relationship was like between the Sephardi Portuguese Jewish community and the Ashkenazi Ascending Jewish community, and why sometimes there were tensions and some strict rules that were laid down in order to keep the sort of ethnicity or the community pure without any mingling?
Yeah, at the start, when the Ashkenazi Jews actually started arriving soon after the Iberians arrived and converted to Sephardi Judaism by Samuel Palash, and then Isaac Uziel, who also came from Fez. But the Ashkenazi Jews who arrived soon afterwards, which is, I would say, 1630s onwards, fleeing the pogroms in Central Europe, Eastern Europe, and they came as an impoverished people, nothing like the Iberians, who came with wealth and the international knowledge of international commerce and trade network in the New World, because when Spanish and Portuguese ships sailed for New World, many of the sailors were Jewish, former Jews, Catholic converts. So they came with the riches, and they came with the knowledge of the New World. They came with the diplomatic skills from North Africa, like the teachers who came, and a negotiator like Samuel Palash. So at the beginning, they looked down on Ashkenazi Jews. It seems impossible to believe now, and that who are these people coming here and telling the Dutch House of Orange and the Dutch Dutch population that they're also Jews, but they look like beggars and peddlers and hawkers, and they came, selling eyeglasses. This famous painting and etching by Rembrandt, where this Jewish peddler is selling eyeglasses to a blind couple.
Wow.
So that's sort of So this is actually an etching based on the Ashkenazi peddlers. So they were ashamed, in a way, of their own people, and they also at the same time realized they would have to look after them. So at the beginning, the Ashkenazi Jews were allowed to pray in the same house of same house, same sort of house of worship. It was not a synagogue as such. It was Bet Yaakov, which was the first congregation, and which is also kind of now described as the first synagogue, but it was the first congregation and that was formed in the very early in the 17th century. So 1603 Yom Kippur service was held in this sort of secret congregation called Bet Yaakov. That's where the first synagogue was. So when the Ashkenazi Jews started arriving, a second synagogue was already formed. Second Sephardi synagogue was already formed in Amsterdam called Neve Shalom. And within the first 35 years, a third synagogue was built there. Well, not built, I would say formed there, which is called Beth Israel. So there are three synagogues, all Sephardi synagogues, and they were functioning in Amsterdam. And so I would say that they just all, at the beginning, that Ashkenazi Jews could come and pray in any of the congregations. And they did at the beginning. And as we know, as I write in the book, that then all these three synagogues were amalgamated into one synagogue called Kahal Kadosh of Talmud Torah by this visionary Jew, Rabbi Sol Levy, who came from Venice. And he also wanted to look after his community. But it was the Ashkenazi Jews who decided to have their own synagogue and not pray with the Sephardi Jews. So they chose to have their own synagogue, and that was also there by the 1640s.
Now, one of the, I guess, main figures in this reconstitution of the Portuguese Jewish community was a very interesting man, a poet by the name of Daniel Levy de Barrios. He's mentioned in a new book that talks about conversion, which was edited by Pablo Machieko and Lundgren, and mentions there that he, in the beginning, when he left, he didn't exactly make an abrupt return to his Jewish faith. He grew up in a converso family in Spain, I believe, right? And he came to Amsterdam like many others before him, and it wasn't an abrupt return where he shed his old ways and became a Jew again. And there's a lot of discussion about what that means exactly, about that when it comes to Spinoza, which is a very fascinating case. But in the case of Daniel Levy de Barrios, what kind of person was he? Especially since he didn't exactly sever his ties. Yeah. He was in the Spanish army. He retained his post in the Spanish army. It's kind of almost unbelievable when you think about it. Go ahead.
Yes. Many of the Jews who arrived, including de Barrios, they actually kept this strong link with Spain and Portugal, with their so-called mother nations. And de Barrios is celebrated by the community as their historian, their in-house historian, who often actually took poetic license to change around dates. And for example, the first Yom Kippur service, which is 1603, and then it's mentioned in his in the book that he writes in the history of the community, and he then changes around, and then he also kind of glorifies the Jews who converted from being Catholic to Judaism. He also kind of glorifies that actually they had always wanted to convert back to Judaism, which may not have been the case. But he's seen as this iconic, this historian who wrote the positive side, the positive aspect or the positive narrative of the community, rather than writing the community that was also hugely conflicted, and the conflict came and to some extent also exercised, by strong and staunch kind of Sephardi figures like Mortera and so Tiberius himself, and followed by Da Costa and then Spinoza. They were all kept under strict control by this figure, Mortera, who made sure that the community didn't sort of veer toward romanticizing their past, which was this Catholic, colorful Iberia, which they kept alive in their new lives, including kind of performing theater. And as the book celebrates, that the theater was a big part of the community. And in fact, the main thread of the book is the kind of theater theme, which was performed. A play was performed in 1624, which actually shook the community. That it was performed in its first congregation in a Bet Yaakov, the house of Jacob, and it was performed by the newly converted Jews in the style of the Spanish one-act play, and so all this is kind of is described in a positive light in Tiberius's account, even though the community was actually the continuity of Judaism, of the new Sephardi Judaism of the community was kept and under a watchful eye of Mortera, Saul Levy Mortera. And I think I have devoted quite a lot of pages describing this amazing figurehead of the community, who is also kind of whose name is also kind of I would say kind of Jews kind of think of as the kind of person who imposed that chelem, both on Uriel da Costa and then afterwards in Spinoza.
Right. It's fascinating because I personally find the concept of fluidity of identity, both ethnic identity and religious identity, very fascinating. And there's been quite an explosion of literature on the topic. Specifically, sub-ethnic identity fascinates me. For instance, people who easily kind of, flow between Ashkenazi Sephardic identity, or even in the Middle Ages, Karaite and Rabbanite identity. It was something that's a lot more fluid. So, for instance, the leader of the community who kind of set the community down, set really deep roots, Mortara himself, for instance, may have been of Ashkenazic descent, yet he's the most Sephardic, the champion of the Sephardic nation. But that's not really important, because at the end of the day, he's the leader. He's the one that sets down the roots of the community, and he's acculturated Sephardic, and that's all that counts at the end of the day. What's more fascinating, I want to get to Benedict Spinoza, because here's a guy who comes also from a converso background, and his family also didn't exactly make the seamless reversion, quote unquote, back to Judaism. And then we have him himself, who kind of is neither here nor there, but he's a new sort of concept in and of itself. You want to talk a little bit about his family and his figure?
Spinoza's family actually arrived quite early on, the beginning of, in fact, I think 1604. So I think a year after the first Yom Kippur service was held in Amsterdam, his family arrived. So his maternal grandfather was also called Baruch, his namesake, and but his Christian, his Catholic name was Henrik, and he actually did not convert to Judaism, or did not publicly convert to Judaism, and his father and his father's side of the family, they were in charge of establishing founding the first yeshiva in Western Europe, and Etz Chaim, which exists till today. and his father was one of the founders of Etz Chaim, where Spinoza studied, and where Mortera was a teacher. Sorry, can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you well.
Hello?
Yes, can you hear me? You have me now? Hello?
Hello?
Yeah, I can hear you. Can you hear me? I guess we got...
Hello?
Yes, can you hear me? Sorry about that. Can you hear me? All right, we'll have to call each other back. Sorry for the technical difficulty.
Hello?
Yeah, can you hear me now?
The person whom you're trying to reach is...
Please bear with us. These things happen. Although I wish they wouldn't, but that's part of life, I guess. Yeah, sorry about that.
Hi.
Something happened. Not sure what.
Yeah.
Okay.
I don't know why. The connection was lost. Yeah.
It happens. Go ahead.
Where was I? Spinoza.
Spinoza,
and his family arriving, yeah?
Yes.
Yeah. So they arrived quite early on in in the community's early history, which I think a year after the first Yom Kippur service was held in 1603, though Spinoza's family, I think, arrived around 1604, around about that time. So his maternal grandfather was his namesake, also called Baruch, and his Catholic name was Henrik Grassesch, I think. And his father and his paternal grandfather, they were founders of. His father was one of the founders of the first yeshiva in Western Europe, called Etz Chaim, which exists still today, and it is an incredible library. I don't know if you have visited Etz Chaim,
No.
And I think visitors can, visiting the synagogue is actually in the basement and the top. On the side of the synagogue, and so you can imagine that this was the first yeshiva where Spinoza was a student of Mortera, so Levy Mortera, this rabbi, Venetian rabbi, who took over the community's leadership in the 1620s. So Spinoza was a student there, and his grandfather was apparently did not convert. His maternal grandfather did not convert in public. Hello.
Yes.
You again.
You lost me again?
No.
Okay.
Okay, I can see it now.
Sorry.
Yeah.
Okay. Go ahead.
So he did not convert publicly to Judaism, to Sephardi Judaism. So when he died, when Baruch Senior died, there was a big question in the community why they would bury him, and then the interesting question that the community had to deal with is that Baruch Senior was not circumcised. And I should mention here that all the adult Jews who arrived in Amsterdam soon after their arrival, they went under the knife, and they went. Mass circumcision ceremonies happened all the time during the sort of 1604 onwards. In fact, the first Ashkenazi rabbi, this is kind of I should mention this also because the first Ashkenazi rabbi who was teaching the community normative Judaism, Levy, who was arrested for conducting this Yom Kippur service in 1603, but he was actually charged with accepting money and presents, like goods and items from the community as a payment for the circumcision service that he was carrying out at the time. So he and his son Aharon together, I think, circumcised something like over 2,000 grown-up men and boys. So let's go back to Spinoza's maternal grandfather. So he wasn't circumcised, so the question was, where would they bury him? And so he was circumcised post-mortem, but still, because he wasn't a bona fide Jew, or he was not considered as one, so he was buried outside the fence of the newly created Jewish cemetery out in Ouderkerk, which is it's kind of house of life, and Bethlehem. It's in the south of Amsterdam, I think 10 kilometers south of Amsterdam. So he wasn't buried inside the main enclosure of the cemetery. He was buried outside the fence of Judaism. So hence, it is said that Spinoza decided to stay outside the fence of Judaism because symbolically, his grandfather, who he was very close to, wasn't buried within the inner circle of Judah, inner circle of the cemetery where so-called bona fide Jews were buried. And so this is a conflict that Yosef Kaplan and many other historians believe, in their writing, that kept Spinoza always skeptical about Judaism and his whether or not Jews were the chosen people, and he questioned that throughout his life, and even mocked in his various writing about the ancientness, as it were, of the community.
So that's Spinoza, and then we'll skip forward a couple of hundred years, and then we get to the eve of World War II, and then what happens? So even before that, when does the very prosperous, wealthy, noted Portuguese Sephardic Jewish community kind of loses its luster, and many people emigrate? What happens? It sets the stage of the sad epilogue.
That is sort of an interesting aspect of the whole kind of the golden age of Sephardi Judaism coming to an end, and a sudden end. And various historians have talked about it, and there isn't any straightforward answer how that could have happened. Did they not have enough money to provide or did they not have the world that they dominated, the networking kind of skills that the Jews had that were no longer needed by the Dutch kind of the Dutch government, or the Dutch which was Dutch. The empire was collapsing, and everything was kind of the new world was then fought over between lots of different powers, and Britain was there, Germany was emerging as a big power, and they were fighting amongst themselves. So the Jews weren't there exclusively with their networking skills. They weren't needed anymore. Their money wasn't needed, or their money wasn't there in the same way. There are various different theories about it, but the most interesting of these, I think, is the Dutch mentality that historians often talked about. And I spoke to this Antwerp historian called Ludo Abicht. He wanted to kind of put it all down to the Dutch mentality, or the practice of versauling. It's called sort of this parallel societies, keeping the parallel societies, so they would progress or go forward in sort of parallel lines, but never actually coming together, never mingling. So what happens when that system is taken away, or the system is punctured somehow, which happened during World War II? The lines then get sort of warped, and they have to then suddenly mingle, and then the suspicion and mutual suspicion and not knowing the other community hits in both communities, or there could be one, there could be two or more parallel communities, and that's when the conflict arrives, and that's what the Dutch Protestants and the Jewish sort of the community which lived as a sovereign society within the countries, the sovereign society within the kind of Dutch the mainstream Protestant society. They didn't know how to speak to each other, and that's what sort of the blame, why the sudden sort of suspicion and the tragedy hit. It's not the tragedy of the Jews who lost themselves, lost the community, and 107,000 Jews were sent to camps, only 5,000 came back. It's also a shameful chapter in the history of Dutch Protestants, of the mainstream Dutch society.
Yeah, it's only recently that the country of Holland has decided to pay out reparations. I think it was the railroad network or something along those lines. It's something that I think Holland, it's kind of surprising, as a country has never really owned up completely to its role during wartime.
No, and also, it didn't. And also, I have tried to kind of find an answer to all of it, and I couldn't. Everyone also blamed I should mention, they also blamed that Hollerith machine, the precursor to IBM computer, which the Germans got hold of, and recorded this excellent kind of record keeping of the Dutch government, the Dutch institutions, which had this record of all the people, and not just the Jews, but also others. And so I think there are so many different. Why did they do it? You would ask, because in neighboring Antwerp, neighboring Belgium, they didn't write on people's identity papers Catholic or Jews. Why did Dutch society? Why did the Dutch do it? And these questions we can go on asking, but we don't know the. I couldn't find an answer to these questions. So. If you have, you can tell me, and
I don't think I'll find one anytime soon. I mean, all types of theories, I don't think it'll ever be exactly understood, because it's something in general. I think on the macro level, it's something hard to understand in every country, how something like this could happen. But to some extent, people would be questioning more about why such a tolerant Protestant, open society, which lacked the vicious anti-Semitism that we saw in parts of Western and Eastern Europe, how that could happen so rapidly and efficiently. So that I can understand why people are more surprised and shocked and hurt, especially Dutch Jews, about what happened in the 40s. It's just tolerance is not acceptance. Acceptance needs a lot more. Acceptance needs understanding the community, and understanding their cultures, and being genuinely interested in the esoteric customs of the immigrants, or the new arrivals amongst them, which the Dutch mainstream never had to do, because there was this system of parallel governance and parallel systems, parallel societies, parallel communities. So the Dutch community was ruled by the Parnasim and the rabbis and the substructure, and there was this mainstream societies. Often they didn't even call the Dutch police if there was a kind of a crime to report, because then they tried to sort it out within the community. So I think it is the big shock of suddenly World War II shook that vasalling, as it were, the parallel system, and the communities did not know how to deal with it. And then came also the reward system that I think 7 guilders a Jew
inform where Jews lived. So of course there was this record of Jews living in wherever, in all of the Netherlands. You knew where Jews lived and where because each person was categorized by this holorith machine in the Dutch kind of obsessive record keeping tradition. And then there was this reward. You got 7 guilders a Jew, and so you reported them, and they were all rounded up. And the saddest part of this story is that they were assembled in the theatre, the Holland Schouwburg Theatre, where they celebrated their old tradition, being sort of performers and actors, and being real lovers of theatre. And that's what they performed a play very soon after they arrived in Amsterdam. And as the tragic part of it is that then they were assembled in this theatre, which can only house 300 people, and at one time there would be 3,000 Jews gathered there before the trains took them to various camps. So whether or not that was already planned, but somehow history also shows that sort of sad side of it, that somehow the place they loved most, that was the place where they said goodbye to their lives and the history of the Golden Age, history of Jews, and in Amsterdam. And I found that part writing this book. The book, obviously, and I end the book at the theatre, and I start the book with the performance of the first play in a synagogue, and I end the book at the theatre where they were gathered in order to be transported to Westerbork and other camps.
Yeah, and I want to end up with another thing that I've also found very fascinating, which you touched on in the book, and that is the Dutch Sephardic Jewish community's assimilation and contact with so many far-flung ventures. So many of the community members were merchants who were involved with the East India Company, and many moved to various Dutch colonies in the Caribbean and other places. And you talk about the curious case of the Curiels. And it's interesting. I'm not going to give away the whole story. I want the reader to read it for itself. There's so many Caribbean and other peoples who don't identify as Jewish, but who claim Sephardic ancestry. And today, with the age of genetic testing and things like that, these things are constantly coming to the fore. What are your thoughts on that?
Yes, you. I think in an email you mentioned that Louis Farrakhan also claims and Sephardi. I think it's really possible because the story of the DNA testing, and I think there's someone else, I can't remember, another artist in Britain, I think recently established with the DNA testing, the Sephardi connection, because it's very possible because they. The Sephardi Jewish connection to the New World, it goes back to Columbus. They went when Columbus went in 1492. The 3 ships that sailed from Portugal, and they were presented by Queen Isabella, and I think some of the sailors were already the sort of Jews who. They were Catholics, and they were, and in the diary of Columbus, I think I mentioned I touch upon this in the book, where he mentions that the Inquisition has been imposed, and these guys can then live with him, and they can be saved somehow, because obviously the identity was already quite ambiguous at the time, because they were seen as new Christians, which is or Marranos, who was suspected of practicing Judaism in secret. And so these young sailors had already sailed with Columbus, and the network was pretty strong in all these places that they settled, and and so we have heard about Samuel Palash, who actually at one point was even involved in piracy. So his contacts, his Sephardi contacts, or his Iberian contacts in the New World would tell him that a Spanish ship with carrying sugar would be passing through the narrow strait, off the coast of Gibraltar, and then he would then go with his Moroccan ships, and then he would then kind of capture this New World sort of cargo of sugar, and then give it to the Dutch House of Orange. These stories, there are these stories, and there are also some records of that. And so the story that I talk about in the book about this connection, this person who no longer was Jewish, he actually grew up as a Dutch Protestant. This Harry Curiel that I talk about, I meet Harry sort of accidentally Harry's sister in a restaurant where I was eating, looking at the kind of this Dutch opera house and sitting there. And his sister tells me that the woman called Claudia tells me that my brother has been researching and found his our Jewish ancestry. So Harry was curious, hence the chapter is called The Curious Case of the Curiels. He realizes that his great-grandfather he was also called Henrik Jacob Curiel, Harry Curiel, so who was born in Paramaribo, and one of the 7 children born to Moses Curiel, Amsterdam Jew, and Elizabeth Christina Na, a slave woman who belonged to a Dutch slave owner, a woman called Anna Hartog Jacobs. So Moses Curiel's son is also called Moses Abraham Curiel, and it goes all the way to there is some marriages between Ashkenazi and the Curiel family. So one of the Curiels married some Rebecca Pollock, and then the marriage wasn't accepted. Some controversy there. Anyway, so Harry then goes all the way back to kind of 1841, and when he actually realized that he's from the circumcision record in Amsterdam Portuguese synagogue that he was circumcised, his great grandfather, and then he was settled. Then after that, he settled in Suriname, and after the British returned the colony to the Dutch Republic, I think in 1814. And so he then started this because, again, thanks to the record keeping, Dutch obsession with record keeping, which enabled Harry Curiel to sort of get the whole entire family tree from 1801 until now, and established his kind of Jewish connection. And he hasn't converted back to Judaism, but he is very proud of his past. He's very proud of his Jewish connection, So I think it was the kind of the golden age of, as you know, this kind of Jewish kind of networking and diplomacy, and as you've mentioned, Barrios, and there are other Jews who were in Amsterdam, had this amazing kind of, they were even ambassadors, posted ambassadors in Portugal when Portugal became independent. So of course, you would want to be part of that golden age. You would want to be part of that connection. I mean, it is a rich history, and I think that explains why Harry Curiel is so happy that he is part of that rich history.
Right. Well, yeah. The book, again, is called Jerusalem on the Amstel, The Quest for Zion in the Dutch Republic. We're with Lipika Pelham, the author. The book is available at Oxford University Press at global.oup.com, as well as your fine bookstores. I want to thank you, Mrs. Pelham, for coming on and talking about a fascinating subject and a fascinating book, and we hope to have you on again soon.
Thank you very much.
Absolutely. Have a great day.
Thank you for having me. Bye.